The deadliest prison in the United States doesn't kill with violence. It kills with distance. Pelican Bay. Death Row for the Living. A prison documentary the system never wanted made. In the United States, 2.6 million children wake up today without a father in the house, not because he left, because he was taken and placed 700 miles away, behind concrete, behind glass, behind a phone call that used to cost more than dinner. Today we are solving one question. What does a system do to a child when it erases their father, slowly, legally, and completely? Stay with us, because the answer will change how you see every prison you've ever driven past.
If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content.
The deadliest prison in the United States doesn't kill with a weapon. It kills with a zip code. Pelican Bay State Prison. Del Norte County, California. 15 minutes from the Oregon border. 700 miles from the neighborhoods that built it. And if you think this is just another prison documentary about walls and cells and steel doors, you are wrong. This is a story about children. About what happens to a child when the system reaches into their home, takes their father, and drives him to the edge of the map. This is the story the United States never put in a brochure. It starts with a door closing. Not a dramatic door. Not a door from a movie. A plain, steel door. Gray. Cold to the touch. It makes a sound when it shuts that the men inside describe the same way, every time, no matter how many years have passed. A low, mechanical thud. Final. Like a period at the end of a sentence that took a lifetime to write. On one side of that door is a man. On the other side is everything he was before the system decided what he would become. A daughter who used to fall asleep on his chest. A son who learned to ride a bike on some ordinary afternoon and looked back over his shoulder just to make sure his father was still watching. A kitchen with a specific smell on Sunday mornings. A voice that said "I've got you," and meant every syllable of it. That is what is on the other side of that door. That is what gets left behind when Pelican Bay closes around a man like a fist. And here is what makes Pelican Bay different from every other maximum security prison in this country. It is not just what happens inside those walls. It is where those walls are. Pelican Bay was built in 1989 in one of the most remote corners of the continental United States. To get there from Los Angeles, you drive north for nearly 9 hours through the Central Valley, up through the Shasta foothills, past the point where your cell phone stops working, through towns so small they don't appear on most maps, through fog that sits on the road like a living thing, until you reach the very top of California, a place that feels, by the time you arrive, like it was specifically designed to be unreachable. Because it was. The men who planned this prison understood something they never put in writing. They understood that distance is its own form of sentence. That geography, applied with enough precision, becomes punishment. That if you place a man 700 miles from the people who love him, love itself becomes a logistical problem that most families cannot solve. For families in Los Angeles and San Diego, the cities that produce the highest concentration of California's incarcerated population, the round trip to Pelican Bay is a minimum of 18 hours. That is 18 hours of highway, 18 hours of gas, 18 hours of food and rest stops, and a car that may or may not make it through the mountains. That is 2 days of lost wages for a mother who is already working 2 jobs to keep the lights on. That is 2 days of childcare arrangements and school absences, and the particular exhaustion of a woman who has been holding everything together alone for years and still gets up before sunrise on a Saturday to make this drive because her children need to see their father's face. Even if that face is behind glass. Even if they cannot touch him. Even if the visit lasts 2 hours and the drive home is 9 hours of silence and the kids fall asleep in the backseat before you hit the freeway and you cry for 4 to 5 minutes in the dark with the radio off because there is simply nothing else left to do. That is what Pelican Bay costs. And that is before we even get to what happens inside. Inside the security housing unit, the part of Pelican Bay known as the SHU, the conditions of confinement are designed to be total. Men held in the SHU spend up to 22.5 hours per day in a cell roughly the size of a parking space. They do not eat with other prisoners. They do not exercise with other prisoners. They do not, in most cases, speak to other prisoners except through the concrete walls that separate them, through vents, through the particular language of survival that men develop when the institution removes every other option. They are alone in a way that most people who have never experienced solitary confinement cannot fully imagine. Not lonely. Alone. There is a difference, and the men who have lived it will tell you so immediately. But it is the visitation policy in the SHU that concerns us here. Because in the security housing unit at Pelican Bay, physical contact between a prisoner and their family is not permitted. No embraces. No handshakes. No small child climbing into a father's lap. You sit on one side of a thick pane of reinforced glass and the person you love sits on the other side, and you speak to each other through a telephone receiver mounted to the wall, and you look at each other through a material that is specifically engineered to keep you apart. This is called a non-contact visit. The name makes it sound administrative, clinical, like a scheduling category. It is not clinical. Ask any child who has ever pressed their hand against that glass and watched their father press his hand against the other side, and they will tell you exactly what it is. Half of the men surveyed who had spent time in the SHU had been there for at least 15 years. In those 15 years, they had not touched another human being in any meaningful sense. Not a handshake, not a pat on the shoulder, not a child's hand inside their own. More than 1 in 3 had gone over 25 years without any physical contact with family. One man, one documented, specific human being, had not had a contact visit in 42 years. 42 years. If you were born the last time that man touched a family member, you would be middle-aged today. You would have children of your own. You would have grandchildren, perhaps. You would have lived an entire human life. And in all of that time, he would not have felt the specific warmth of another person choosing to be close to him. We need to pause on that. Not because it is the most dramatic statistic in this story, it is not. We need to pause on it because it tells us something precise about what this institution was designed to do. It was not designed to rehabilitate. It was not designed to prepare men to return to their families and their communities. It was designed to remove, to isolate, to place a man so far outside the boundaries of normal human experience that the world he came from slowly becomes a memory, then an abstraction, then something he is no longer certain he can trust himself to return to. And while all of that is happening to him, something else is happening to his children. 4 years, and this detail is important, because it speaks to something deliberate about the architecture of isolation at Pelican Bay. The SHU did not allow prisoners to be photographed. Family members who had not visited, who could not make the 18-hour drive, who were too young or too poor or too exhausted or too frightened of what they would feel standing on the other side of that glass, those family members stopped knowing what their loved one looked like. A daughter who was 4 years old when her father went to Pelican Bay would be a teenager before a photograph of him existed that she was legally allowed to have. She would be constructing his face from memory, from old photos taken before the arrest, from the way his voice sounds on a phone call, trying to match a sound to a face that time has been quietly erasing. Following a hunger strike in 2011, in which hundreds of men at Pelican Bay refused food for weeks to protest their conditions, the policy changed. Disciplinary-free prisoners were permitted to have 1 photograph taken and sent home per year. 1 photograph per year. To a child who has not seen her father's face in a decade, this is everything. To a researcher examining the policy from the outside, it is a detail so small it barely registers. That gap, between what means everything to a family and what barely registers to an institution, is the space this documentary lives in. Because here is what we know about the families on the other side of that gap. Here is what the research tells us, quietly and consistently, in study after study that rarely makes the front page of any newspaper. Approximately 2.6 million children in the United States currently have a parent who is incarcerated. By the time they turn 14, 1 in 14 American children will experience a resident parent being taken to jail or prison. These children are not a footnote. They are a generation. They are sitting in classrooms right now. They are doing homework. They are playing on sports teams and fighting with their siblings and lying awake at night thinking thoughts that children their age were not designed to think. In 2007, an estimated 744,200 state and federal prisoners were fathers to nearly 1.6 million children under the age of 18. Of those fathers, 54% had been the primary financial provider for their household before incarceration. More than half. Which means that in more than half of these families, the income did not simply decrease when the father was taken. It disappeared. It was replaced not by another income but by debt. By the specific financial mathematics of a single parent trying to keep a household alive on wages that were already not enough, now without the person who was supposed to be helping carry it. And the children absorb all of it. The financial instability. The emotional weight of a caregiver who is doing everything alone. The stigma of a father in prison, which children learn to manage in public in ways that would break your heart if you watched closely enough. The confusion of a justice system that has taken their father and given them no language to explain it to themselves, let alone to their classmates or their teachers or the school counselor who pulls them aside to ask if everything is okay at home. Research finds significant increases in aggressive behavior among children whose fathers are incarcerated, effects that are measurably stronger than those associated with other forms of father absence. This matters. It tells us that something particular to parental incarceration, not just the absence, but the nature of the absence, the stigma and the silencing and the institutional weight of it, compounds the damage in ways that ordinary father absence does not. When fathers are removed during the years between ages 3 and 5, children show measurably more attention problems and aggression by the time they begin school. By middle childhood, both teachers and caregivers report elevated emotional problems, behavioral difficulties, and the early indicators of the kind of trajectory that the system will eventually interpret as evidence that the child, too, needs to be removed. This is how cycles are built. Not with malice. With policy. With distance. With a phone call that for decades cost more than a family could afford, and a drive that for decades was longer than a family could manage, and a glass partition that for decades stood between a father's hand and a child's hand and communicated, every single visit, the same message: this man is not yours anymore. He belongs to us now. A recent change in California law made prison calls free. For some men at Pelican Bay, that single policy change meant hearing a family member's voice for the first time in years. Not the first time that month. The first time in years. Stop and hold that for a moment. A father who had not spoken to his child in years. Not because he did not want to. Not because the child did not want to hear him. Because a phone call cost money that a family living at the edge of survival could not justify. And then one day, because of a law, it didn't. And somewhere in Pelican Bay, a phone rang on the other end of a call that should have been made 1,000 times before, and a voice said hello, and another voice said dad, and something that had been frozen for years began, very slowly, to thaw. That is the story of the forgotten fathers of Pelican Bay. Not the crime that brought them there. Not the case files or the sentencing guidelines or the legal arguments. The story of what the distance does. To the men. To the mothers holding it all together. And most of all, to the children, who did not choose any of this, who did not sign any document, who committed no offense against the state, and who are serving a sentence anyway. We are just getting started. There is a word that institutions use when they want to make something sound manageable. They call it processing. When a man is arrested, he is processed. When he is sentenced, he is processed. When he arrives at Pelican Bay and the steel door closes behind him and the last sound he hears from the outside world is the mechanical thud of a lock engaging, that too is called processing. It is a word designed to make a human being sound like paperwork. And paperwork, unlike a father, unlike a husband, unlike a son, does not have children waiting at home who will wake up the next morning and ask where he is. This act is about the system, not the crime, not the courtroom. The system that exists after the gavel falls. The machinery that takes a man from his family and moves him, step by step, further from everything that might have kept him human. And the other system, the invisible one, that his family builds from scratch to survive his absence. Two systems running simultaneously. One with the full weight of the state behind it. One held together by a mother's hands and a child's stubbornness and letters written on prison issue paper at 2 in the morning when the cell block finally goes quiet. We need to understand both. The California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation operates 35 adult institutions across the state. 35 prisons, scattered across California's geography with a logic that has very little to do with keeping families connected and a great deal to do with land availability, political history, and the economics of rural employment. When a man is sentenced and assigned to a facility, his family is not a primary consideration in that assignment. His security classification is. His gang affiliation, if any, is. The administrative needs of the department are. His daughter's school schedule is not. His son's baseball games are not. The 18-hour drive his mother would have to make to visit him is not. This is not a secret. It is not hidden in any document. It is simply the way the system was built, and the way it continues to run, because the people most affected by it have the least power to change it. For a man assigned to Pelican Bay, the distance is the defining fact of his incarceration. Everything else, the cell, the schedule, the restrictions, exists within the context of that distance. 700 miles from Los Angeles. 900 from San Diego. Unreachable by public transportation. Unreachable, for most families, by any means that doesn't require significant sacrifice. And so the visits don't happen. Not because families don't want to come. Not because fathers don't want to see their children. But because the system has made wanting insufficient. You can want something with everything you have and still be unable to cross 700 miles of California highway on a bus driver's salary with 3 children and no one to watch them while you're gone. And the system knows this. The system has always known this. Inside Pelican Bay, time works differently. This is not a metaphor. It is a neurological reality that researchers who study solitary confinement have documented with increasing precision over the past 3 decades. When a human being is removed from the normal rhythms of social interaction, from conversation, from physical contact, from the 1,000 small calibrations that other people provide just by being present, the brain begins to lose its grip on time. Days blur. Weeks become indistinguishable. A man in the SHU who has been there for 10 years will tell you that the first year felt like 10 and the last 9 felt like 1. That time has become a texture rather than a sequence. That he measures it not in days or months but in the increments of his daughter's voice getting older on the phone, in the way his son's handwriting changed between the letter he sent at 8 years old and the letter he sent at 13. That is how fathers in Pelican Bay experience their children growing up. In increments of evidence. A voice dropping. A signature becoming more confident. A question in a letter that a child would not have known to ask 3 years ago. They are not watching their children grow. They are receiving data about children who are growing without them, and assembling that data into something that resembles knowledge of a person they are no longer certain they know. And the children are doing the same thing in reverse. They are assembling a father from fragments. From letters. From phone calls. From the one photograph per year that the policy allows. From the stories their mother tells, which are always careful and always partial, because there are things about this situation that a good mother tries to protect her children from knowing for as long as possible. From the 2-hour visits behind glass that happen once or twice a year if the family can manage the drive, which often they cannot. This is the psychological architecture of Pelican Bay for the families outside its walls. Not violence. Not drama. Just the slow, steady erosion of presence. The way a person becomes a concept when you cannot touch them. The way love, maintained only through language and glass and a telephone receiver, begins to feel like an act of faith rather than an experience of reality. The letters are the most important thing. Every man who has been inside will tell you this, and every family member on the outside will confirm it. The phone calls are vital, but the phone calls disappear. You hang up and the voice is gone, and you are left with only your memory of what was said, and your memory, especially under stress, is unreliable. But a letter stays. A letter is an object. You can put it in a drawer and take it out again. You can read it when you need to hear that voice. You can show it to your child and say, this is what your father wrote, these are his actual words, this is his actual handwriting, this is what his hand looked like pressing a pen against paper in a cell 700 miles away while he was thinking about you. The letters that come out of Pelican Bay are among the most carefully written documents produced anywhere in the American penal system. Not because the men who write them have more education than prisoners elsewhere, but because they understand, with absolute clarity, that the letter is all they have. That a careless word in a letter will live in their child's hands for years. That a phrase misread or a tone misunderstood can damage a relationship that they have no other means of repairing. Every letter is therefore an act of extreme deliberateness. Every word is chosen. Every sentence is constructed to do two things simultaneously: to communicate something true about the writer's inner life and to protect the reader from the parts of that inner life that would cause them harm. This is a specific kind of intelligence. It is the intelligence of a man who has been stripped of every other form of expression and has learned to make language do the work that presence used to do. It is, in its way, remarkable. And it is also heartbreaking, because it is the product of a loss so total that language became the only tool left. The phone calls changed everything. And for years, the phone calls cost more than everything. For the majority of the period since Pelican Bay opened in 1989, calls from inside California prisons were placed as collect calls, billed to the receiving family at rates that had nothing to do with the market price of a phone call and everything to do with the contracted agreements between prison systems and telecommunications companies that had been negotiated with no input from the families who would be paying them. A 50-minute call home could cost a family $10, $15, $20. In a household already running at the financial edge, that is not a small number. That is a grocery calculation. That is the difference between calling your father this week and eating adequately this week, and for a child who is already managing more than any child should have to manage, that calculation lands with a specific weight. The research on prison phone call costs and family contact is unambiguous. When calls are expensive, contact decreases. When contact decreases, family bonds weaken. When family bonds weaken, reentry becomes harder, recidivism becomes more likely, and children become more vulnerable to the same pathways that brought their fathers into the system in the first place. The phone call pricing was not incidental to the cycle. It was structural to it. It was a mechanism by which the system perpetuated itself, quietly and profitably, at the expense of the most vulnerable people in the equation. When California passed legislation making prison calls free, the change was immediate and it was profound. Men who had not spoken to family members in years, not because the relationship had broken down, not because the love had diminished, but because the call cost money that did not exist, suddenly had access to something that should never have been taken from them. A voice. A connection. The specific medicine of hearing someone who loves you say your name. For some men at Pelican Bay, that first free call was the first time they had spoken to their children in 3 years. 5 years. In some cases longer. And what do you say? When the phone rings on the other end and a voice answers and you know that the distance between you is still 700 miles of California highway, that the glass is still there, that the policy is still the same, but the sound of that voice is suddenly, finally, actually in your ear, what do you say? Most of them said the same thing. I'm still here. I think about you every day. I'm still here. But the phone call, free or not, exists within a system that controls everything around it. The calls are monitored. They are recorded. Anything said on a prison phone call is potentially evidence, potentially used in future proceedings, potentially read by a correctional officer who is also a stranger and who has no stake in the emotional integrity of what is being communicated. This is not paranoia. This is policy. And it means that every phone call a father makes to his child is filtered through the knowledge that someone else may be listening. That the conversation cannot be fully private. That there are things you cannot say, not because they are untrue, but because the wrong ears are always a possibility. This changes the phone call. It changes what a father can offer his child through that medium. It creates a performance of fatherhood rather than the experience of it. It places a ceiling on vulnerability, on honesty, on the kind of unguarded conversation that is actually the substance of a parent-child relationship. You can say I love you. You can ask about school. You can say I'm proud of you and mean it absolutely. But you cannot always say the things that would actually help your child understand what is happening, why it is happening, and what it means for the future, because the system is listening and the system has demonstrated, repeatedly, that it will use what it hears. And so the father learns to speak in a register that is simultaneously loving and guarded, warm and careful, present and strategic. And the child, who is perceptive in the way that children who have survived difficult things are perceptive, senses the layer beneath the warmth, senses that there is more being held back than is being given, and interprets that gap, not always consciously, not always articulately, but deeply and durably, as evidence that even in the moments of connection, something is being withheld. That full presence, the full unguarded presence of a father, is something they are not permitted to have. Now let's talk about what this does to a developing brain. The research on children of incarcerated parents is extensive and it points consistently in one direction. These children are not simply sad. They are not simply missing a parent in the way that children of divorce or children of traveling parents miss a parent. What they are experiencing is a specific constellation of stresses that the research has begun to identify as its own category of childhood adversity, with its own distinct neurological and behavioral signature. Paternal incarceration during the years between 3 and 5, the years when the architecture of a child's emotional regulation is being built, is associated with measurably elevated attention problems and aggression by the time that child begins school. Not predisposed to. Associated with. Measurably. This is not speculation. These are children who were studied before, during, and after their father's incarceration, whose outcomes were tracked with the same rigor applied to any other public health question, and whose data tells a story that the public health community has been trying to get policymakers to read for 20 years. By middle childhood, the years between roughly 6 and 12, the years when a child is building their understanding of how the social world works, what relationships look like, what they are permitted to expect from the adults in their lives, children with incarcerated fathers show elevated rates of emotional problems, behavioral difficulties reported by both caregivers and teachers, and the early behavioral indicators of antisocial development. They are more likely to be pulled out of class, more likely to be referred to a counselor, more likely to be identified by a system that is very good at identifying problems and considerably less good at addressing their causes, as a child who needs intervention. What they need is their father. What they receive is a referral. And there is one more statistic that needs to be said plainly because it rarely makes it into the public conversation about incarceration. Having a recently incarcerated father significantly increases a child's risk of homelessness. Not through some indirect or complicated causal chain. Directly. The loss of income. The loss of the father's social network and the support that network provided. The increased stress and depression in the primary caregiver, who is now managing everything alone. The reduced eligibility for certain forms of public assistance that attach to households with an incarcerated member. All of these forces push a family already living at the financial margin closer to the edge. And some of them go over. Children of incarcerated fathers are sleeping in shelters. They are moving between relatives. They are experiencing the specific trauma of housing instability on top of the trauma of family separation, on top of the stigma of a father in prison, on top of the developmental vulnerability of simply being a child in a world that was not designed with their well-being as a priority. This is the system, not the cell, not the sentence. This, the racial architecture of this story cannot be discussed as a footnote. It is the frame. African American children are 7.5 times more likely than white children to have an incarcerated parent. Hispanic children are 2.5 times more likely. Among black children born in the 1970s, approximately 15% had a parent behind bars. By the time the children of the 1990s came of age, that number had nearly doubled to 28%. On any given day in the second decade of this century, 1 in 9 black children in the United States had a parent in custody. 1 in 9. Not 1 in 900. Not 1 in 90. 1 in 9. These numbers are not the product of differential rates of criminal behavior. The research on this is also extensive and also consistent. They are the product of differential rates of policing, prosecution, sentencing, and incarceration, a set of institutional choices made over decades that have concentrated the weight of the carceral system on specific communities with a precision that, if it were applied to any other public health outcome, would be recognized immediately as a crisis. It is a crisis. It has been a crisis for a long time. And the children who are living inside it did not create it and cannot dismantle it and are simply trying, with the tools available to them, to grow up. There is a moment that comes in nearly every interview with a family member of a Pelican Bay prisoner. It comes at different points in the conversation for different people, but it always comes. It is the moment when the person being interviewed stops talking about the logistics, the drive, the cost, the phone calls, the letters, and starts talking about what it actually feels like. What it feels like to love someone who the system has made nearly impossible to reach. What it feels like to explain to a 6-year-old why daddy is not coming home. What it feels like to watch your child press their hand against a pane of glass and understand, in that moment, that this is the closest they are going to get to their father for a very long time. The mothers describe it as a specific kind of grief. Not the grief of death, which has a cultural script, a language, a set of rituals designed to help the living absorb the loss. This grief has no script. The person is alive. They can be reached, technically. You can call them, technically. You can visit them, technically. But the presence you need, the daily, physical, unguarded, unmonitored presence of a partner and a parent and a person who is yours, that is gone. And there is no funeral for it. There is no moment when the community gathers around you and acknowledges the magnitude of what you have lost. You are simply expected to continue. To work. To parent. To hold the household together. To answer your child's questions as honestly as you can manage. To make the drive when you can afford it. To answer the phone when it rings. And to write back. Always write back. Because on the other end of that letter, in a cell the size of a parking space, 700 miles away, a man is waiting to know that he is not forgotten. That his children still know his handwriting. That the distance has not yet done what the distance was designed to do. That he is still, against everything the system has arranged to suggest otherwise, their father. There is a specific age at which children who have grown up with an incarcerated parent begin to understand what actually happened to them. Not what they were told. Not the careful version that their mother constructed to protect them through the early years, the version where daddy is away and daddy loves you and daddy thinks about you every single day. The real version. The version with the full weight of the institution in it, the sentencing guidelines and the classification system and the 700 miles of deliberate distance and the glass partition and the phone call that used to cost more than dinner. There is a specific age at which all of that lands. And when it lands, it does not land gently. It lands like a door closing. That same low mechanical thud. Final. Except this time the door is not closing on their father. It is closing on the version of their childhood they thought they had. On the story they told themselves to make sense of the absence. On the belief, maintained with the fierce and necessary stubbornness of a child who needs to believe it, that this situation was temporary. That it was manageable. That the love on the other side of the glass was sufficient to bridge the distance. Some of them close that door quietly, alone, in their bedroom at night. Some of them close it loudly, in a way that their teachers and counselors and the juvenile justice system will have opinions about. But all of them close it. Because growing up means eventually trading the story that protected you for the truth that will define you. This act is about what happens after that door closes. About the scars that the system leaves on the children it never formally sentenced. About the young men and women who grew up with Pelican Bay as a fixed point in the geography of their emotional lives and who are now trying to build adulthood on that foundation. And about what it would take, what it would actually, concretely, specifically take, to interrupt the cycle before it claims the next generation. The researchers who study adverse childhood experiences, what the field calls ACEs, have identified a set of childhood stresses that correlate with measurably worse outcomes across virtually every dimension of adult health and well-being. Physical health, mental health, educational attainment, economic stability, relationship quality, life expectancy. The original ACE study, conducted in the late 1990s, identified 10 categories of childhood adversity. Parental incarceration is one of them. Not a footnote. Not a subcategory. One of the 10. What this means, in practical terms, is that a child who grows up with a parent in prison carries an elevated ACE score that places them in a higher risk category for depression, anxiety, substance abuse, heart disease, and a range of other outcomes that will not fully manifest until they are adults but that are being written into their neurological architecture right now, in the years when their brains are most plastic and most vulnerable. The body keeps the score, as the research has long established. And the body of a child raised in the specific grief of parental incarceration is keeping a score that no one sat down with them to explain, that no one warned them they were accumulating, and that they will be paying down for the rest of their lives. This is the scar that doesn't show. The one that doesn't appear in any visible place on the body. The one that shows up instead in the way a 23-year-old responds to authority. In the way a young woman constructs her relationship with intimacy. In the way a young man understands what it means to be a father, having been raised by the absence of one. In the specific internal architecture of a person who learned, at an age when children should be learning something entirely different, that the people who love you can be taken away by forces entirely outside your control and that there is nothing you can do about it and there will be no adequate explanation of it and the grief you feel will not be publicly recognized because your father is not dead, he is in prison. And those two things are treated as categorically different by a society that has not fully reckoned with the fact that for a child, they are not. Let us talk about the young men specifically. Because there is a particular and well-documented pathway that begins with paternal incarceration and ends, for a statistically significant number of young men, in the same institution that took their father. Not because the outcome is inevitable. It is not inevitable. but because the conditions that produce it are not accidental either, and understanding those conditions is the only way to interrupt them. A boy who grows up without his father in a household that is financially strained, emotionally burdened, and socially stigmatized is a boy who is looking for several things simultaneously. He is looking for male modeling, for an example of what it looks like to be a man in the world, since the primary example was removed before he was old enough to absorb it fully. He is looking for peer belonging, for the particular safety of being part of something that has rules and hierarchies and a clear sense of who is in and who is out, because the institution that took his father operated by exactly those principles, and those principles are at least legible even when they are destructive. And he is looking for economic agency, for some means of generating income and dignity in a context where the legal economy has very little to offer a young man with an elevated ACE score, an inconsistent school record, and a family history that many employers will find on a background check before they find anything else. The street economy offers all three: community, structure, income. And it offers them immediately, without a waiting period, without a credential requirement, without the particular humiliation of applying for something and being told you do not qualify. This is not a moral failure. It is a rational response to a specific set of conditions that the system created and that the system has shown very little interest in dismantling. And when that rational response results in an arrest, a conviction, a sentencing, and an assignment to a facility 700 miles from home, the cycle does not just continue. It deepens. It adds another child to the 2.6 million. It adds another family to the invisible population of people managing an impossible situation with insufficient resources and no public acknowledgement of their grief. This is how institutions reproduce themselves. Not through malice. Through the precise and patient logic of a system that was never designed to end. The daughters carry a different version of the scar. Not better. Not worse. Different. Where the research on sons of incarcerated fathers points toward externalized behaviors, aggression, delinquency, contact with the juvenile justice system, the research on daughters points more often toward internalized ones. Depression, anxiety, the specific psychological profile of a young woman who learned early that the people she loves can disappear without warning and who has organized her emotional life around the management of that knowledge. There is a term in the clinical literature for the hypervigilant emotional state that develops in children who have experienced significant attachment disruption. It describes a child who has become exquisitely sensitive to signs of threat in their relationships, who read social situations with an intensity that exhausts them, who cannot fully relax into connection because connection has proven to be unreliable, who is always, at some level, waiting for the door to close again. This is not a character flaw. It is an adaptation. It is what the brain does when it is trying to protect a child from a pain it has already experienced once and cannot risk experiencing again. Daughters of incarcerated fathers describe, in interview after interview, a particular loneliness that they do not have adequate language for. It is not the loneliness of being alone. Most of them were not alone. They had mothers, siblings, extended family, friends. It is the loneliness of carrying something that no one around them fully understands. The loneliness of a grief that has no public name. Of a father who is alive but unreachable. Of love that is real and sustained and mutual and completely unable to do what love is supposed to do, which is to make you feel less alone in the world. They describe learning to perform normalcy. To answer the question about their father with the version of the story that produces the least follow-up. To manage the expression on their face when the subject comes up in a context where the full truth would be too complicated or too exposing. To be, in public, a version of themselves that does not include the 700 miles or the glass or the letters or the one photograph per year. And to carry the full version privately, in the particular interior space that children who survive difficult things learn to maintain, where the truth lives alongside the performance and the distance between the two becomes, over time, one of the defining features of who they are. There are fathers inside Pelican Bay who have become, by any measure, extraordinary parents. This is not a paradox. It is the result of a specific kind of reckoning that incarceration sometimes forces and that freedom sometimes prevents. Men who, in the daily rush of life outside, might have been present but distracted, providing but not fully attentive, loving but not fully articulate about that love. Men like this sometimes find, in the absolute removal of every other option, that the letter is not just their only tool but their best one. That the enforced slowness of a cell, the mandatory stillness of confinement, has given them something that the world outside rarely offers. Time to think about what they actually want to say to their children. Time to become, on paper, the father they were not always able to be in person. The letters that emerge from this process are remarkable documents. They are patient. They are specific. They ask questions about their children's lives with the attentiveness of someone who understands that every detail is precious because details are all they have. They offer advice carefully, without the authority of physical presence to back it up, in a register that is more collaborative than directive. More I've been thinking about this and here is what I believe than do what I say because I am your father. They express love in language that most fathers who are present never have occasion to develop, because presence substitutes for language in a way that absence cannot. A child who receives these letters grows up with a particular relationship to their father's interior life. They know things about him, his fears, his regrets, his values, his sense of humor, his philosophy of how to live, that children who grow up in the same house as their father often do not know until much later, if at all. The letters create a form of intimacy that is real and that is specific to the conditions of incarceration. And it does not replace what was lost. It does not come close to replacing what was lost. But it is something. In a situation defined by absence, it is a significant and durable something. The visitation footage, when it exists, tells a story that no written document can fully carry. It tells it in the body language of a man sitting down at the visiting station and seeing, through the glass, a child who has grown since the last time. It tells it in the way he leans forward. In the way his hands, which have nowhere useful to go, settle on the counter in front of the glass in a posture that is almost prayer. It tells it in the way the child, who may have been nervous or resistant or quiet in the car on the way there, becomes, the moment they see their father's face, entirely and simply a child who misses their father. There is no performance in these moments. That is what the footage captures that language cannot. The absolute absence of performance. Two people who love each other, separated by a material that was specifically engineered to keep them apart, finding in the space of 2 hours everything that the system has been working for months or years to erode. Connection. Recognition. The specific, irreducible fact of each other. And then the visit ends. A dark gray concrete mannequin in a navy windbreaker appears at the door. Time. The father stands. The child, who understood intellectually that this moment was coming, discovers that understanding it intellectually was not the same as being ready for it. The phone receiver goes back on the hook. The father is led one way. The family goes another. The parking lot. The car. The 9-hour drive home through the fog in the mountains and the dark, with the children in the backseat going quiet in the way that children go quiet when they are processing something that they do not have words for yet. The camera, if it is there, stays on the backseat. On the small featureless forms of children sitting with something large and wordless moving through them. On the particular stillness of a child who has just said goodbye to their father through a pane of glass and is now trying to locate, somewhere inside themselves, the place where they put the feelings they cannot afford to feel all the way. They find it. They always find it. Because they have been finding it since the first time. Because children who grow up in this situation develop, out of sheer necessity, a capacity for emotional containment that would astonish you if you understood what it cost them to build it. There is a conversation that needs to happen in this country that is not happening. It is not a conversation about guilt or innocence. It is not a conversation about whether crimes should have consequences. Those conversations are happening everywhere, constantly, loudly, and they are important. But they are not this conversation. This conversation is about the 2.6 million children who committed no crime, who were not charged, who were not tried, who were not sentenced, who are simply living inside the consequences of a system that did not include them in its calculations and has not, in any meaningful structural way, included them since. What would it look like to include them? It would look like placement policies that consider family proximity when assigning inmates to facilities. It would look like visitation infrastructure that makes the drive possible for families who cannot afford it on their own. It would look like contact visitation policies in the SHU that recognize the developmental necessity of physical touch for children. It would look like phone call costs that do not force a family to choose between connection and dinner. It would look like school counselors who are trained specifically in the trauma of parental incarceration and who can offer children a language for what they are experiencing rather than a referral for what they are expressing. None of these things are radical. None of them require dismantling anything. They require only the decision that these children matter, that their development matters, that the cycle that leads from a father in Pelican Bay to a son in Pelican Bay 20 years later is not inevitable, and that the point of intervention is not the son's arrest but the decade of conditions that preceded it. That decision has not yet been made. Not at the scale required. Not with the resources required. Not with the urgency that 2.6 million children require. But the letters keep coming. The phone calls keep happening. The families keep making the drive, the ones who can, through the fog in the mountains and the 18 hours of California highway, because love, it turns out, is more durable than policy, more persistent than distance, more present, even through a pane of glass, than the system designed it to be. The fathers who are forgotten by the system are not forgotten by their children. And the children who the system never counted are counting every day. Every letter, every call, every photograph, every visit, every moment of contact that the institution allows and every moment of presence that it cannot, no matter how much concrete and distance and policy it deploys, fully take away. That is the scar. And underneath the scar, still alive, still insisting on itself against every institutional force arranged to extinguish it, is the thing the scar was trying to protect. A child who knows their father's handwriting. A father who knows his child's voice has changed. A family that the system tried to make into a statistic and that refuses, with everything it has, to become one. We have been inside this story for a long time now. Long enough to know the drive. Long enough to know the sound of the door. Long enough to know what a letter feels like when it has been folded and unfolded so many times that the paper goes soft at the creases, the way something does when it has been kneaded repeatedly and without apology. Long enough to know what a child looks like in the backseat of a car driving away from a prison in the fog, carrying something wordless and large and entirely their own. Now we need to ask the hardest question. Not who is responsible. That question, important as it is, tends to produce arguments rather than answers, and this story has not come this far to end in an argument. The hardest question is simpler and more demanding than that. It is this: what do we do with what we now know? What does a society do? What do we do, specifically, practically, today, when we understand that 2.6 million children are living inside a wound that we created, that we maintain, and that we have the capacity to treat but have not yet chosen to? That is the question that Act 4 is going to sit inside. Not circle. Not gesture toward. Sit inside. Because the children in this story do not need another document that describes their pain and then offers a footnote about systemic change. They need the systemic change. And the first step towards systemic change is always the same. It is the moment when enough people understand something clearly enough that not acting on it becomes the more uncomfortable option. We are trying to be that moment. Let us go back to the beginning. Not to Pelican Bay. Further back. To the question of what a prison is for. There are 4 answers that philosophers and policymakers and criminologists have offered to that question over the past several centuries. Punishment, deterrence, incapacitation, rehabilitation. Every prison system in the world is built on some combination of these 4 purposes, weighted differently depending on the era, the politics, the culture, and the particular fears of the society doing the building. In the United States, in the era that produced Pelican Bay, the weighting was heavily toward the first 3 and nearly absent on the 4th. Punishment for the offense committed. Deterrence of future offenses by others who might consider the same path. Incapacitation of the individual so that they cannot commit further harm during the period of their confinement. These 3 purposes shaped everything about how Pelican Bay was designed. The location, the architecture, the SHU, the non-contact visitation policy, the distance from the communities that produced the population it was built to contain. Rehabilitation, the 4th purpose, the one that requires the institution to engage with the human being rather than simply contain them, was not the organizing principle. And the families paid for that choice. The children paid for that choice. And the communities that received men back after decades of isolation, men who had been stripped of every social skill and every family connection that rehabilitation is supposed to preserve, paid for that choice in the form of the recidivism rates that no one in the system wanted to be held accountable for. This is not a political statement. It is a design critique. Pelican Bay was built to do specific things and it did them. The question is whether those things were the right things to build toward. And the answer, when you look at what was built and what it cost and who paid the cost, is increasingly and uncomfortably clear. There is a researcher, a woman who has spent 20 years studying the children of incarcerated parents, who describes her work with a phrase that has stayed with every journalist and policymaker who has heard it. She says, "We are asking children to pay a debt they did not incur." That is the precise and complete description of what is happening to the 2.6 million. They did not incur the debt. They were not present when it was created. They were not consulted. They were not warned. They simply woke up one morning in a household that had been reorganized around an absence, and they have been paying the interest on that absence every day since, in the currency of their development, their stability, their mental health, and their future. A society that is serious about justice, not just punishment, but justice, the full and honest accounting of what is owed and to whom, has to include these children in its calculations. It has to ask not just what the convicted person deserves but what the unconvicted child needs. It has to hold both of those questions simultaneously and resist the temptation to answer the first so loudly that the second cannot be heard. We have not been doing that. The evidence is in the 2.6 million. But here is what else the evidence shows. And this part of the story is less told and more important than almost anything else in this documentary. The evidence shows that when families are supported, when the distance is reduced, when contact is maintained, when children have access to the tools they need to process what they are experiencing, outcomes change. Measurably. Significantly. Across every indicator that the research tracks. Children who maintain regular contact with an incarcerated parent show lower rates of behavioral problems than children who lose contact entirely. Not no problems. Lower problems. The contact itself, imperfect, monitored, conducted through glass or over a phone line or in the pages of a carefully written letter, is protective. It tells the child something that the absence of contact cannot tell them. It tells them that the relationship is real. That their father is a person, not a concept. That love, even at 700 miles, even through a pane of reinforced glass, even on a monitored phone call, is not a performance. It is a fact. This finding should be the organizing principle of every policy decision made about incarcerated parents and their children. Not as a reward for the parent. not as a privilege to be earned and revoked. As a public health intervention for the child. As the recognition that a child's relationship with their parent is not the parent's property, it is the child's right. And that right does not expire when the parent is convicted. It does not get filed in a drawer with the sentencing documents. It travels with the child, alive and insistent and in need of protection, into every classroom and every counselor's office and every backseat of every car driving home from a prison visit through the Northern California fog. There are people inside the system who understand this. This is important to say clearly, because the narrative of institutional indifference, while structurally accurate, can obscure the individual human beings within the institution who are working, often against significant resistance, to do better by these families. Correctional officers who go out of their way to make a visitation experience less traumatic for a child. Administrators who have pushed for contact visitation policies in units where contact had not previously been permitted. Social workers inside prison systems who have built programs, underfunded, understaffed, perpetually threatened by budget cycles, specifically designed to maintain the parent-child relationship through incarceration. These people exist. Their work matters. And they are doing it inside a structure that was not built to support what they are trying to do, with resources that are never sufficient, against a cultural current in corrections that has historically treated family contact as a management challenge rather than a human necessity. They deserve to be named, not as evidence that the system is fine, it is not fine, but as evidence that the system is not monolithic. That within the concrete and the fluorescent light and the Navy windbreakers, there are people who see the child on the other side of the glass and understand that the child is also, in a very real sense, in their care. Now let us talk about the fathers themselves. About who they are after years or decades inside Pelican Bay. About what the institution has done to them and what they have done, in response, with what the institution left them. The psychological literature on long-term solitary confinement is unambiguous about the damage. Anxiety, depression, hypersensitivity to stimulation, difficulty with cognitive tasks that require sustained attention. A flattening of emotional response that is the brain's adaptation to an environment in which emotional response has no social function. Paranoia, difficulty trusting. The specific disorientation of a man who has spent so long in a space where nothing changes that the prospect of a space where everything changes has become, paradoxically, its own form of threat. These are not character flaws. They are injuries. They are what happens to a human nervous system that was built for social connection and has been deprived of it for years or decades. And they are the conditions under which the men of Pelican Bay, if and when they are released, are expected to return to their families and their communities and function. To be fathers. To be partners. To hold jobs. To navigate a world that has changed enormously during their absence and that has very little infrastructure designed to help them make the crossing. The reentry literature is full of these stories. Men who wanted desperately to be present for their children and who found, in the first weeks and months after release, that the wanting was not enough. That the years in the SHU had built walls inside them that were, in some ways, harder to dismantle than the ones outside. That the child who had been receiving their carefully written letters and had constructed, from those letters, an image of a father, wise, patient, reflective, present on the page, encountered, in the actual man who came home, someone who flinched at loud noises and needed the room to be a specific temperature and could not always access, in real time and under pressure, the emotional availability that the letters had suggested. This is not failure. This is injury meeting expectation. And the gap between the two is where so many families, having survived the incarceration, find themselves struggling in the reentry. Having held on through everything. Having made the drive and written the letters and pressed their hands against the glass and told their children that daddy is coming home and kept the love alive through every institutional obstacle the system could place in its way, and then finding that coming home is its own crossing, with its own distances, and that the work is not over when the door opens. It is different work. But it is still work. There is a specific image that appears in the testimony of children of incarcerated fathers again and again, across different ages and different family structures and different lengths of sentence. It is the image of their father's hands. Not his face. The face, as we have established, becomes uncertain over time, subject to the erosion of memory and the inadequacy of one photograph per year. But the hands. The hands writing the letter. The hands pressed against the glass. The hands that, in the child's earliest memory, before the door closed, were large and warm and specific in the way that only the hands of the person who holds you can be specific. Children who grew up visiting Pelican Bay describe pressing their hand against the glass and feeling, through the coldness of the material, something that was not warmth but was the closest available approximation of it. The pressure of a hand on the other side of a surface that could not be crossed. The communication of presence through the only medium the institution allowed. They describe this not with bitterness, or not only with bitterness, but with a kind of fierce precision, the way you describe something that mattered enormously and that you understood, even at the age you were when it happened, was not enough and was also everything. That is the emotional reality of Pelican Bay for the families outside its walls. Not enough and also everything. The letter that cannot replace presence but is the only thing available. The phone call that cannot replace touch but carries a voice. The photograph that cannot replace a face but proves that the face still exists. The visit that cannot replace daily life but creates, in 2 hours through glass, a memory that will last until the next one. Not enough. And also everything. What do we owe these children? The answer is not complicated. It is only difficult, in the way that things are difficult when they require resources and political will and the institutional courage to reorganize systems around values they were not originally built to express. We owe them proximity. We owe them the policy decision that a child's access to their incarcerated parent is a factor worth weighing when assigning that parent to a facility. We owe them transportation. We owe them the infrastructure that makes an 18-hour round trip into something a working family can actually accomplish without sacrificing a week's wages. We owe them contact. We owe them the policy recognition that a child pressing their hand against glass and feeling nothing pressed back is not a neutral experience and should not be the default condition of visitation. We owe them counselors. We owe them the school-based support structures that can give children a language for what they are experiencing before that experience expresses itself in ways that bring them into contact with the same system that took their parent. And we owe them the acknowledgement, public, institutional, unambiguous, that they are not invisible. That the 2.6 million are not a footnote in the story of American incarceration. That they are, in fact, the story. That any honest accounting of what the prison system costs has to include them in the ledger. That their development, their mental health, their future, their children's future, is part of the calculation. Has always been part of the calculation. Has simply, for too long, been the part that the calculation left out. The last thing we want to leave you with is not a statistic. We have given you enough statistics. The statistics are real and they matter and they should be cited and repeated and placed in front of every policymaker who is making decisions about how this system is run. But statistics are not what change minds. What changes minds is a specific, particular, irreducible human moment. So here is the one we want to leave you with. A man in the SHU at Pelican Bay has been inside for 19 years. His daughter was 3 when the door closed. She is now 22. She has driven the 18 hours to visit him 11 times in those 19 years. 11 times in 19 years. Each time, she has sat on one side of the glass and he has sat on the other and they have spoken through a telephone receiver for 2 hours and then the dark gray concrete mannequin in the navy windbreaker has appeared in the doorway and time has been called and she has driven 9 hours home through the mountains and the fog in the dark. She was asked, in an interview, what she would say to her father if the glass were not there. If the receiver were not there. If the institution, for one moment, simply stepped aside and let the distance close. She thought about it for a long time. Long enough that the interviewer almost moved on. And then she said, I wouldn't say anything. I would just stand there. I would just let him know what it feels like to be in the same room as him without anything between us. That is what Pelican Bay took from her. Not a sentence. A room. The simple, ordinary, irreplaceable experience of being in the same room as her father without anything between them. That is what 2.6 million children are missing. That is what we built. That is what we can choose, if we decide to unbuild. The question is not whether we are capable of it. The question is whether we have decided that these children are worth it. We think they are. The only question left is whether you agree.